goes your manic pixie dream boy.
Stop. Justin Cole's not my anything.
It's not too late. It's not too late.
You are intolerable.
Did she do it?
Same old conversation, all the small talk that I hate. And I never thought I'd say it, but I'm sick of everyone. I need to sweat it out.
I could switch concentrations. Performance?
Girl, we both know you're a much stronger composer than clarinetist. And there's no money in classical.
Well, jazz.
Never mind. Forget I asked.
Maybe Garrett will help.
Where the fuck is Garrett? Guys?
Graham? Brought your refill.
One's my max. Night before a game.
So strict.
Are you also you, Ali? I can't just find a husband day one of college. I can't talk to a guy like it's no big deal. I walked in on Garrett Graham in the shower and I fell over a laundry cart.
You did what?
I don't want to talk.
So the Bruins are watching every game, how I play, how I behave. I can't lose focus. So, like I said before, all I can offer is casual.
Well, I don't want that anymore.
No, I take it back!
But no one is expecting you to be him.
He is.
All our parents have expectations, G. Shit,
Some stories are not really about heroes and villains. Some stories are about who gets the power to decide which one you are. That is what makes Maleficent such an interesting film to open. On the surface, it looks like a dark fantasy reimagining of a classic fairy tale. You see the horns, the wings, the castle, the curse, the glowing magic, the sleeping princess, and you think you already know the shape of the story. You think the box is already labeled. Good on one side, evil on the other, light over here, darkness over there. But then the film turns the box around. Suddenly, the so-called villain is not just standing in the shadows. She is asking you to look at how those shadows were created in the first place. Welcome back to the Film Box, where we do not just talk about what happens in a film. We open it, we look inside, We pull apart the choices, the emotions, the hidden details, the beautiful cracks, and the moments that stay with you longer than you expected. Every film is a box. We open it together. And today we are opening Maleficent, the 2014 fantasy film that takes one of Disney's most iconic villains and asks a question that is much more personal than most fairy tales ever dare to ask. What if the monster was not born a monster? That question is the heartbeat of this film, not the spectacle, not the magic, not even the familiar fairy tale structure. The real heartbeat is pain, betrayal, protection, power, and the strange, complicated way a broken heart can turn into something dangerous before it slowly learns how to become something human again. Because Maleficent is not just a movie about a curse, it is a movie about the story behind the curse. That difference matters. Most fairy tales begin when the damage has already been done. A villain enters the room, makes a terrible choice, and the rest of the story becomes about defeating that villain. But Maleficent slows everything down and asks us to look before the moment everyone remembers. Before the castle, before the spinning wheel, before the sleeping curse, before the world decided that this woman was pure darkness. And once you look there, the film becomes more layered than it first appears. It becomes a story about trust and what happens when trust is destroyed. It becomes a story about innocence and how quickly the world can take it away. It becomes a story about power, but not the clean heroic kind, the messy kind, the kind people use when they have been hurt so badly that kindness feels unsafe. That is why this film has always divided people in an interesting way. Some watch it as a visually rich fantasy adventure with Angelina Jolie giving a commanding performance at the center. Others watch it and feel that it changes too much, softens too much, explains too much. And honestly, that tension is exactly what makes it worth discussing. Because Maleficent is not trying to be a simple copy of the story you already know, it is trying to make you question the version you accepted, and that is risky. When a film touches a character this famous, it cannot move quietly. Every choice becomes a statement, every change becomes a debate. If an emotional turn asks the audience to let go of a memory they may have carried for years, that can be powerful. It can also be frustrating, sometimes both at once. So, in this breakdown, we are going to open the film layer by layer. We will talk about why Maleficent works as a character study. We will look at the visual design, the fairy tale atmosphere, the way the film uses darkness and beauty side by side, and how Angelina Jolie's performance gives the movie its strongest pulse. We will also be honest about where the film struggles, where the story feels too smooth, where certain characters feel underused, and why some emotional choices land harder than others. But before we get into spoilers, before we walk through the full story, before we open the ending and the hidden meaning underneath it, I want you to sit with one idea. Maleficent asks you to reconsider the first story you were told, not just about this character, about people in general. Because in real life, we do this all the time. We see someone after the damage, after the anger, after the walls are already up, and we decide that is who they are. We do not always ask what happened before. We do not always ask who they were before the wound. We do not always ask what was taken from them, what they lost, or what they are trying to protect. This film takes that human habit and dresses it in fantasy. Horns, wings, thrones, forests, magic, a curse that echoes through a kingdom. But underneath all of that, the question is painfully simple. Can someone who has been deeply hurt still choose love? That is where Maleficent becomes more than a retelling. That is where the film starts to open. Here is the thing that makes Maleficent instantly fascinating. The film takes a character who was once designed to be feared from a distance and pulls her so close that you almost cannot look away. That is risky, because mystery is a huge part of why the original version of Maleficent became iconic. She did not need much explanation. She did not need a long backstory. She entered the story with elegance, control, and terrifying confidence. She felt like evil wearing royal robes. She was not trying to be understood. She was simply there, and the room changed because of her. So when a film says, now we are going to explain her, it is walking on dangerous ground. Because the more you explain a villain, the more you can accidentally shrink them. But Maleficent does something clever. It does not just ask why did she become cruel, it asks something sharper. What if the story you remember was told from the wrong side of the castle wall? That one idea changes everything. Suddenly, the curse is not just a wicked act, it is the final shape of an old wound. Suddenly, the horns are not just a sign of darkness. They become part of a visual language about power, isolation, and survival. Suddenly, the cold stare is not empty, it is defensive. It is controlled, it is the face someone wears when the world has taught them that softness can be dangerous. And this is where the film gets its hook. It is not asking you to forgive every choice Maleficent makes. That would be too simple. It is asking you to understand the emotional road that leads there. There is a big difference. Forgiveness says, what happened does not matter anymore. Understanding says, what happened matters so much that we need to look at it honestly. That is the energy of this movie. It takes a famous villain and does not erase her darkness. Instead, it puts that darkness under glass and asks where it came from. It asks what betrayal does to someone who once trusted completely. It asks what power becomes when it grows out of grief instead of love. It asks whether revenge can ever truly heal the thing that created it. And because this is a Disney fantasy, those questions are wrapped in beauty. You get growing forests, strange creatures, sweeping landscapes, castle politics, magical battles, and the familiar shape of a fairy tale that almost everyone recognizes. But underneath that familiar shape, there is something more wounded and more complicated. That is what makes the film hard to dismiss. Even when the story becomes simple, the central idea keeps pulling you back. Because you are not just watching a villain cast a curse. You are watching someone become the version of herself that the world is most afraid of. And the film's smartest move is that it does not make that transformation feel sudden. It begins with innocence. It begins with wonder. It begins with a world where Maleficent is not a threat at all. She belongs to nature, to freedom, to movement, to the open sky. She is connected to the Moors in a way that feels almost spiritual. She is not ruling through fear. She is protecting something alive. Then the human world enters, and immediately the film creates contrast. One side is organic, strange, magical, and free. The other side is hungry for control. One side feels like life growing in every direction. The other side feels like stone, metal, crowns, and ambition. This is not subtle, but it works because fairy tales are not always about subtlety. They are about emotional clarity. And Maleficent's emotional clarity is this. The deepest wounds often come from the places where we once felt safest. That is the hook. Not the curse, not the sleeping princess, not the familiar name. The hook is watching a character built for darkness begin in light, then slowly realizing how much has to be taken from her before that light starts to twist. And once the film puts that idea in motion, you begin watching everything differently. You watch her expressions differently. You watch the way she stands apart from others differently. You watch the way she uses silence differently. You watch the way she looks at Aurora differently because that relationship becomes the emotional test of the entire movie. Can Maleficent see innocence without wanting to destroy it? Can she protect someone connected to the very world that hurt her? Can love return to a heart that has rebuilt itself around anger? That is where the film becomes more than a villain origin story. It becomes a story about what survives after betrayal, and whether the part of you that was kind, open, and trusting can ever come back once it has been buried under pain. That is why Maleficent still has power, not because every scene is perfect, not because every character is fully developed, not because the film answers every question beautifully. It has power because its central idea is immediately emotional. The monster may not have started as a monster, and once you accept that, the whole fairy tale becomes unstable because now you are not just waiting to see who wins. You are waiting to see whether someone lost can still be found. Before we step fully into the story, you have to look at the strange creative space Maleficent came from, because this film was not just another fantasy project. It was Disney, looking back at one of its most famous animated nightmares and asking, what happens if we open the door behind her? And the first major thing to understand is that Maleficent was directed by Robert Stromberg, a filmmaker whose background was not originally built around traditional character drama, but around visual worlds. Before directing this film, Stromberg was widely known for production design and visual effects work, especially on huge fantasy and science fiction films. That matters because when you watch Maleficent, you can feel that the world itself is treated almost like a character. The Moors do not feel like a simple background. They feel alive. The glowing plants, the strange creatures, the floating shapes, the textures of bark, stone, wing, fog, and light, all of it creates a space that feels emotionally connected to Maleficent herself. When she is free, the world feels open. When she is wounded, the world feels darker. When she begins to soften, the environment seems to breathe again. That is not accidental. A director with a visual design background naturally thinks in images first. So even when the script becomes simple, the film keeps communicating through atmosphere. The Moors tell you what Maleficent cannot always say out loud. The human kingdom tells you the opposite. Stone walls, sharp towers, iron weapons, crowns, straight lines. Everything feels controlled, owned, and defended. The film's visual conflict begins before the characters even explain it, and once you notice that, the opening scenes hit differently. You are not just seeing two neighboring lands, you are seeing two ideas of power. One power grows, the other power conquers. The second important production detail is Angelina Jolie's casting, because honestly, the entire film depends on it. Maleficent is not a character you can play halfway. She has to be theatrical enough to feel mythic, controlled enough to feel dangerous, and wounded enough to feel human. If the performance becomes too soft, the character loses her edge. If it becomes too cold, the emotional journey does not work. Jolie brings both. Her face does an enormous amount of storytelling in this film. Sometimes it is the sharp smile, sometimes it is the stillness, sometimes it is the way her eyes seem to be watching from behind a wall that she built years ago. And that is why the movie can survive moments where the plot itself feels thin. You keep watching because Jolie gives Maleficent a presence that feels bigger than the scene around her. The costume and makeup choices also lean into that presence. The sculpted cheekbones, the headpiece, the severe silhouette, the dark robes, the red lip, the almost blade-like elegance. These choices connect her to the animated icon while still making her feel physical and real. She is not just wearing darkness. She looks like she has shaped darkness into armor. And once you think of the costume that way, her appearance becomes emotional instead of just stylish. It is protection. It is performance. It is a warning sign she chooses to wear. The third detail is the film's relationship with Sleeping Beauty itself. Maleficent is not a loose fantasy that only borrows a few names. It is built directly around one of Disney's most recognizable fairy tales, but it changes the emotional center. In the older version, Aurora's story is the main fairy tale path and Maleficent is the force that interrupts it. In this version, Aurora becomes part of Maleficent's healing journey. That is a massive shift. It means the film is not really asking, will a princess wake up? It is asking, can the woman who cursed her become the one who loves her most honestly? That changes the meaning of so many familiar elements. The curse is no longer just a plot device. It becomes a mistake born from pain. The child is no longer just an innocent victim. She becomes the living challenge to Maleficent's bitterness. The famous idea of true love also changes shape. Instead of treating love only as romance, the film asks whether care, regret, and chosen protection can be just as powerful. That is why this version became memorable for so many people. It does not simply tell the fairy tale, it rearranges the emotional furniture inside it. The fourth detail is the casting of Elle Fanning as Aurora, because the role is deceptively difficult. Aurora in this version is not written with heavy psychological complexity. She is almost symbolic. She represents innocence, openness, and a kind of trust that Maleficent can no longer access in herself. That can easily become flat if played without warmth. Fanning gives Aurora a soft brightness that makes the relationship work. She plays her less like a perfect princess and more like someone whose goodness comes from curiosity. Aurora is drawn toward the strange, the magical, the hidden. She is not afraid of the Moors in the way the human kingdom is. She looks at Maleficent and does not immediately see a monster. That matters because Aurora's innocence is not passive, it becomes disruptive. Her kindness slowly breaks through Maleficent's defenses because it arrives without strategy. She is not trying to win Maleficent over. She simply does not know how to hate her. And when you watch their scenes with that in mind, the emotional structure becomes clearer. Aurora is not the loudest character in the film, but she is the pressure point. She forces Maleficent to confront the fact that the world can still produce something gentle. The fifth production detail is the scale of the film itself. Maleficent was designed as a major fantasy blockbuster, not a small character piece. That means it had to balance two different missions at once. On one side, it wanted to reframe a famous villain through trauma, regret, and emotional transformation. That balance is both a film's strength and one of its weaknesses. When it works, the fantasy scale makes Maleficent's emotions feel legendary. Her pain becomes myth, her anger becomes weather, her protection becomes almost cosmic. But when it does not work, the blockbuster machinery can rush past the most interesting emotional questions. Some scenes feel like they want to sit in silence longer, but the film has to keep moving toward the next magical event. Still, that tension is part of what makes Maleficent worth opening. It is a personal wound told through a studio-sized fairy tale. It is intimate and enormous at the same time, and that is why the behind-the-scenes context matters so much. This film was never only about making the villain look cool. It was about taking a familiar symbol of evil and rebuilding her through visual design, star presence, fairy tale revision, and emotional reversal. Look closer, and you can see the whole creative gamble. Disney was not just selling you a darker version of Sleeping Beauty. It was asking whether one of its most famous villains could become the emotional center of her own story. And once that question is on the table, the film becomes much more interesting than a simple fantasy retelling. Because now, when we open the box, we are not just asking what happens. We are asking who got to tell the story first. Maleficent is a 2014 dark fantasy film directed by Robert Stromberg, starring Angelina Jolie as Maleficent, Ellie Fanning as Aurora, Charles Copley as Stefan, Sam Riley as Diaval, and Amelda Staunton, Juno Temple, and Leslie Manville as the three pixies responsible for raising the young princess far away from the castle. On paper, it belongs to the fantasy adventure space. It has kingdoms, magic, curses, creatures, forests, battles, and a princess whose destiny seems written before she is old enough to understand it. But at its heart, Maleficent is not really about royal destiny. It is about emotional damage. It is about how a person can be turned into a legend by the people who fear her, and how that legend can hide the truth of who she once was. So here is the spoiler-free verdict before we go deeper. Maleficent is not a perfect film, but it is a fascinating one. It is visually rich, emotionally dialect, and carried by a lead performance that gives the whole movie its identity. But when the film focuses on Maleficent herself, her pain, her power, her loneliness, and her slow confrontation with what she has become, it becomes genuinely compelling. This is the kind of film you watch when you want a familiar story turned inside out, not destroyed, not mocked, reframed. It is not saying the old story never mattered. It is saying the old story may not have been complete. The dangers are obvious, but Maleficent pushes against that. It asks what happens when beauty and danger live in the same person. The film also exists as part of a larger Disney pattern, taking animated classics and rebuilding them through live-action spectacle. But Maleficent stands out because it is not simply trying to recreate a beloved film scene by scene. It has a stronger angle. It takes the most visually memorable figure from Sleeping Beauty and makes her the emotional center. That is why the movie does not feel like a straightforward princess story. Aurora matters deeply, but Maleficent is the gravitational force. Everything bends around her. The Moors, the kingdom, the curse, the fear. the tenderness, the anger, even the idea of true love itself. And if you're watching this film for the first time, that is the main thing to understand before spoilers begin. This is not a story designed around surprise in the usual way. You may already know the broad fairy tale shape. The real question is not whether destiny will arrive. The real question is whether the film can make you feel differently about the person who started it all. Who is this film for? It is for you if you like fairy tales with darker emotional edges. It is for you if you enjoy villain centered stories that try to complicate what you thought you knew. It is for you if you love fantasy worlds where production design, costume, and performance do a lot of the storytelling. And it is especially for you if you are interested in stories about misunderstood characters, wounded protectors, and the thin line between power and pain. But if you want a tightly plotted political fantasy, or a version of Maleficent that remains purely mysterious and terrifying, this version may not fully satisfy you. It explains her, it softens her, it reshapes her. For some people, that is the magic. For others, that is the problem. That is what makes the film interesting. Maleficent is not just asking whether you believe in curses. It is asking whether you believe a person can be more than the worst story told about them. The first feeling Maleficent gives you is not fear. That is important. You might expect fear because the name itself carries a shadow. Maleficent is one of those characters who arrives in your mind already dressed in darkness. Before the film even begins, you think of horns, fire, curses, and a voice that can turn a royal celebration into a nightmare. So the natural expectation is that the film will open with menace, but instead it opens with wonder. That choice changes everything. The beginning of Maleficent does not introduce her as a monster. It introduces her as part of a living world. The must feel wild, strange, playful, and untamed. This is not a polished kingdom where everything has a title and a rule. It is a place of movement. Creatures fly, crawl, glow, and bloom. Nature is not decoration here, nature is home. And young Maleficent belongs to that home completely. That is what surprised me most the first time watching it. I walked in expecting a dark villain story, but the film gave me a wounded fairy tale about innocence before corruption. It does not rush to the evil. It lets you see the softness first. It lets you see freedom first. It lets you see how open Maleficent once was before the world taught her to close. That opening stretch matters because it gives the entire film its emotional contrast. If we only met Maleficent after the damage, her anger would be powerful, but distant. We would understand her as an image, a figure, a symbol. But because the film lets us see her before the wound, every later moment carries a sense of loss. You are not just watching darkness appear, you are watching light become defensive. That hits differently. The atmosphere in the early scenes feels almost like a dream someone remembered from childhood. The colors are brighter, the creatures are odd but not threatening. The landscape feels open instead of tracked. There is a sense that this world has its own rules, but those rules are built around balance rather than domination. Maleficent is not trying to own the Moors, she is part of them. Then the human kingdom appears and the emotional temperature changes. Suddenly, the film begins to feel sharper, less free, more suspicious. The kingdom is not introduced as pure evil, but it feels heavy with desire. It wants land, it wants power, it wants control over what it does not understand. That is where the film's fairy tale simplicity actually works, because the contrast is immediate. The Moors feel alive, the kingdom feels hungry, and at the center of that contrast is Stefan. The first connection between Maleficent and Stefan is presented with a softness that makes the later betrayal sting. Their bond begins with curiosity. Two young people from different worlds, both drawn towards something they do not fully understand. For a while, the film lets that connection feel innocent, not grand, not epic, just simple enough to believe. That simplicity is the trap. Because when trust begins gently, betrayal lands harder. The first 10 minutes hook you because they quietly prepare you for a fall. You can feel the film placing two ideas beside each other, Maleficent's openness and the human world's ambition. You know those ideas cannot live peacefully forever. You can feel the story moving toward a fracture even before it arrives. And when it does arrive, the film changes its skin. That is the moment where the first watch feeling shifts from fairy tale wonder to emotional injury. The movie stops feeling like a magical origin and starts feeling like a story about violation, grief, and the loss of self. Again, the film keeps this within a fantasy frame, but the emotional meaning is clear. Something deeply personal is taken from Maleficent, something connected to her freedom, her identity, and her sense of safety. After that, the movie becomes colder. Not visually dead, but emotionally colder. Maleficent's posture changes. Her face changes. Her relationship to the world changes. And that is where Angelina Jolie's performance starts carrying the film with real force. She does not play the transformation like simple rage. She plays it like someone who has learned to turn pain into control. That is what makes her so watchable. There is elegance in the way she moves, but also distance. There is humor sometimes, but it has an edge. There is power, but the power feels like it grew around a wound. You can sense that Maleficent is not only punishing the world, she is protecting herself from ever being vulnerable to it again. And then Aurora enters the emotional structure. At first, Aurora is not someone Maleficent wants to love. She is a reminder, a living symbol of the kingdom, the betrayal, the curse, and the old anger. But the film slowly turns that reminder into something else. Aurora becomes the one innocent thing that Maleficent cannot fully hate. That is where the movie becomes hard to look away from. Not because the plot is unpredictable. In many ways, you can feel where it is going. But because the emotional reversal is satisfying to watch, you want to see the wall crack. You want to see whether this character, who has built herself into a legend of fear, can still respond to gentleness. The first watch feeling then is not really shock, it is recognition. You recognize the shape of the fairy tale, but the emotion underneath has changed. You recognize the curse, but now it feels tragic instead of simply wicked. You recognize the princess, but she is no longer the only heart of the story. You recognize the villain, but the film keeps asking you to look again. And that is why Maleficent works best when it slows down and lets you feel the space between hatred and love. Because the most compelling thing in the film is not the magic. It is watching someone who believes she has become unreachable slowly discover that one small innocent presence can still reach her. The filmmaking language of Maleficent is built around contrast. That is the first thing you feel if you look past the plot and pay attention to the image itself. Almost every major visual choice in the film is asking you to compare two worlds, two emotional states, and two versions of power. The moors are designed with curves, strange organic shapes, soft movement, glowing life, and a sense that nature is never still. The human kingdom is built around stone, metal, straight lines, walls, weapons, and vertical towers. One world expands, the other world contains, one world breathes, the other world locks things into place. That visual contrast is simple, but it serves the story because Maleficent is a character caught between freedom and control. When she belongs fully to the Moors, the camera often allows the world around her to feel wide and alive. The frame gives space to movement. Wings, trees, creatures, water, air, everything has rhythm. The world does not feel built by human hands. It feels grown, and that matters because Maleficent's power is not presented like royal authority. It is not throne-based power. It is elemental power. Comes from connection, from nature, from flight, from the idea that she is strongest when she is not trapped. So when the film focuses on her wings, it is not just giving you a fantasy detail. It is giving you visual identity. The wings are freedom, selfhood, innocence, and power all at once. Every time the film emphasizes flight, it is really emphasizing the part of Maleficent that exists before fear becomes her armor. That is why the camera's relationship with her changes after the emotional fracture of the story. The world around her begins to feel more controlled by shadow. The framing becomes sharper. Her silhouette becomes more severe. She is still powerful, maybe even more visibly powerful, but the image no longer feels free in the same way. Her strength has become defensive. Look closer at how the film uses her face. Angelina Jolie's Maleficent is often photographed like an icon, not just a character. The camera understands the power of stillness. It does not always need her to move quickly or explain herself. Sometimes the shot simply lets her stare, smile slightly, or hold silence longer than expected. That stillness gives her authority, but it also creates distance. She becomes almost statue like at times, which is perfect for the story because this is a woman who has turned herself into something untouchable. The camera reinforces that. She is often framed with height, symmetry, and shadow, making her feel larger than the people around her. Even when she is emotionally wounded, the image refuses to make her look small. That is one of the film's strongest technical choices. It lets vulnerability and dominance exist in the same frame. The lighting also does heavy emotional work. The moors often glow with soft, magical light, but it is not clean in a polished palace way. It is textured, misty, green, gold, blue, earthy. It makes the fantasy world feel alive rather than decorative. The human interiors, by contrast, feel colder and heavier. Even when they are grand, they are not warm. They carry the weight of ambition. This helps the audience understand the emotional map without needing constant explanation. You can feel which spaces are safe and which spaces are dangerous. You can feel in which world is connected to life and which world is obsessed with possession. The color palette follows the same pattern. Early brightness gives way to darker, richer tones as Maleficent changes. Black becomes more than a costume color, it becomes a visual mood. But the film is careful not to make darkness ugly. Maleficent's darkness is elegant, controlled, and strangely beautiful. That is important because the movie is not saying pain makes her monstrous in a simple way. It is saying pain has reshaped her into something magnificent and dangerous. That balance is everywhere in the production design. The costumes do not just tell you who is good or evil. They tell you who is guarded, who is exposed, who is trapped in ceremony, and who belongs to something older than the kingdom. Maleficent's clothing often feels like armor made from shadow. Aurora's look is softer, more open, more connected to innocence. Stefan's visual world becomes increasingly stiff, heavy, and enclosed, reflecting a mind that is being consumed by fear and power. The editing rhythm is also worth noticing. Maleficent moves like a fairy tale, not like a dense political drama. Scenes often arrive with clean emotional purpose. The film does not always linger as long as it could, and that can make some moments feel rushed. But technically, the editing keeps the story accessible and dreamlike. It moves from image to image with the feeling of a story being remembered, not investigated. That fairy tale rhythm is both beautiful and limiting. It allows the film to feel mythic, but it also means some emotional consequences pass quickly. A slower edit might have made certain character turns deeper. More silence could have allowed the pain to breathe. But the film chooses momentum and visual clarity over psychological weight. The visual effects are strongest when they feel connected to emotion. The creatures of the moors work best when they make the world feel diverse and alive, not just busy. The magic works best when it expresses Maleficent's mood. A gesture, a burst of clean energy, a transformation, a wall of thorns. These images matter because they externalize what she is feeling inside. That is the real technical key to the film. The fantasy is strongest when it becomes emotional language. The camera, lighting, costumes, production design, and effects are all trying to show you the same thing. Maleficent is not simply becoming darker, she is becoming harder to reach. The world around her changes because she changes. The shadows deepen because her trust has collapsed. The beauty remains because she is never only a villain. And that is why the film's style works even when the storytelling becomes uneven. It understands the image of Maleficent. It understands that she must feel frightening, wounded, regal, lonely, and magnetic all at once. The story begins by taking the version of Maleficent you think you know and quietly removing the villain mask. Before the curse, before the castle, before the black robes and the fear, There is a young fairy living in the moors, and the moors are not just a magical forest. They are a whole separate world, full of creatures that do not belong to human logic. It is wild, strange, bright, and alive in every corner. Maleficent is not an outsider there. She is part of its rhythm. She flies over it, protects it, understands it, and carries herself with the confidence of someone who has never been taught to be ashamed of her own power. Then Stefan enters her world. At first, he is not a king, he is not a villain, he is a human boy, poor, curious, ambitious, and drawn toward a place he has been told to fear. Their first connection is built on curiosity rather than conflict. She sees something different in him. He sees something magical in her. And for a while, the film lets their bond feel innocent, like two children standing between two worlds and imagining that maybe those worlds do not have to destroy each other. But this is a fairy tale, and fairy tales are always watching innocence closely. As Maleficent and Stefan grow older, the distance between them grows too. She remains connected to the moss. He becomes increasingly pulled toward human ambition. And that difference matters because the film is slowly showing us two kinds of desire. Maleficent wants to protect what is alive. Stefan wants to rise in a world that measures value through status, power, and proximity to the throne. The human kingdom under King Henry looks at the moors not with wonder, but with hunger. The magical land is something to conquer, something to claim, something that refuses to bend. When the king's forces try to invade, Maleficent becomes the Moor's defender. She rises not like someone looking for war, but like someone refusing to let her home be taken. This is the first time the film shows the true scale of her power. She is graceful, but she is not fragile. She is magical, but not delicate. She can command the land around her. She can turn the living world into a defense against human violence. In that moment, Maleficent becomes more than a fairy. She becomes the wall between greed and nature. And that victory changes everything. King Henry is humiliated, wounded in pride, and obsessed with revenge. He promises power to whoever can defeat Maleficent. That promise reaches Stefan, and this is where the film's emotional wound begins to form. Because Stefan knows her, he knows her trust. He knows the part of her that once believed in him. That is what makes his betrayal so devastating. He returns to her not as an open enemy, but as someone wearing the memory of love. Maleficent lets him close because part of her still believes in what they once were. And instead of killing her, Stefan chooses a different cruelty. He takes from her something deeply tied to her freedom and identity, her wings. The film treats that loss as more than physical. It is spiritual. It is emotional. It is the moment her world breaks. When Maleficent wakes and realizes what has been done, the film shifts completely. The softness leaves the air. The sky is no longer hers. The person she trusted has used her trust as a weapon. And from that moment, her pain begins turning into something colder. Stefan rises because of what he took. Maleficent falls because of what was taken. That balance is the dark center of the film. From there, Stefan becomes king. But the throne does not make him whole, it only hides the emptiness underneath. Maleficent, meanwhile, retreats into anger. She still protects the Moors, but the likeness is gone. She crowns herself in shadow. She transforms her pain into authority. She saves Diaval, a raven, and makes him her companion, her spy, and in many ways the closest thing she has to a voice of reason. Their bond brings some sharpness and humor to the story, but it also reveals how lonely Maleficent has become. She has power, but very little peace. Then comes the royal celebration. Stefan and the queen have a daughter, Aurora, and the kingdom gathers to honor the child. This is the moment where the old fairy tale shape returns. The baby, the blessings, the court, the expectation of joy. But now, when Maleficent arrives, we understand that she is not entering as random evil. She is entering a Rome built around the man who betrayed her, the crown he gains through that betrayal, and the child who represents his future. So when she casts the curse, it is not simple wickedness. It is revenge shaped like poetry. It is pain turned into prophecy. She cannot undo what Stefan did to her, so she wounds the future he is trying to protect. She places a faith over Aurora that will arrive when the princess grows older, and she makes the solution seem almost impossible because she no longer believes in the kind of love that could break it. That is the tragedy of the curse. It reveals what Maleficent has lost inside herself. She does not simply curse Aurora because she hates a child. She curses Aurora because she hates the world a child came from. She hates Stefan. She hates the memory of trust. And most of all, she hates the idea that love could be real after what love became in her own life. Stefan, terrified, sends Aurora away to be raised in secret by 3 pixies. But the plan is flawed from the beginning. The pixies are well meaning, but clumsy and often ridiculous. They are not exactly ideal guardians. Maleficent discovers where Aurora is almost immediately, and what begins as distant observation slowly becomes something much more complicated. At first, she watches the child with irritation. Aurora is the living reminder of the curse, the kingdom, and Stefan. But Aurora is also innocent. She has no awareness of the political weight placed on her. She does not know why her life is being shaped by forces older than her own memory. She simply grows. And Maleficent keeps watching. This is where the film's emotional rhythm becomes interesting. Maleficent tries to remain detached, but detachment becomes harder every time Aurora survives because of her unseen protection. When the pixies fail, Maleficent quietly helps. When danger comes close, Maleficent intervenes. She tells herself she does not care, but the story keeps showing us the truth before she is ready to admit it. Aurora grows up believing in the wonder around her. She is drawn to the moors, to magic, to beauty, and eventually to Maleficent herself. And because Aurora does not understand fear in the way adults do, she approaches Maleficent with openness. She does not see the villain from the castle story. She sees a strange, powerful presence who has always been near her life. That innocence disarms Maleficent, not all at once, not easily, but slowly. The relationship between them becomes the heart of the film. Aurora gives Maleficent something she has not experienced in years: trust without calculation. She is not trying to use her. She is not trying to defeat her. She is not trying to take anything from her. She simply believes there is goodness there. And that belief becomes dangerous to Maleficent's anger. Because anger survives by repeating one story: everyone will betray you, softness is foolish, love is weakness, and the world cannot be trusted. Aurora quietly challenges that story just by existing. Her presence makes Maleficent remember the part of herself that was open before Stefan broke it. Meanwhile, Stefan is deteriorating inside the castle. The throne he wanted has not freed him. It has trapped him. His fear of Maleficent becomes obsession. His guilt twists into paranoia. He becomes less a loving father trying to protect his daughter and more a ruler consumed by the enemy he created. That is one of the film's sharper ideas. Stefan is haunted not only by Maleficent's power, but by his own crime. As Aurora nears the age named in the curse, Maleficent realizes the horror of what she has done. The curse that once felt like revenge now feels like a prison. She tries to reverse it, but her younger wounded self made it too strong. That is painful because it shows how choices made in rage can outlive the emotion that created them. Maleficent has changed, but the curse has not. Aurora eventually learns the truth of who she is and where she comes from. She is pulled back toward the human kingdom, toward the father she never really knew, and toward the destiny that has been waiting for her since infancy. Maleficent wants to save her, but the machinery of the fairy tale is already moving. The spinning wheel appears. The curse fulfills itself. Aurora falls into the enchanted sleep, and now the story becomes a test of what true love actually means. The kingdom looks toward the familiar solution, the romantic shape fairy tales usually promise. Prince Philip is brought in as the possible answer, but the film does not treat that idea as emotionally earned. He is kind, but he barely knows Aurora. His presence is not empty, but it is not deep enough to carry the weight of salvation. That is the point. The real love story in Maleficent is not romantic. It is the bond between the cursed child and the woman who cursed her, between innocence and regret, between the wound and the healing that arrives too late. or almost too late. Maleficent stands before Aurora, not as the villain celebrating victory, but as someone crushed by remorse. She finally understands that the child she tried to punish became the person who brought her heart back to life. That emotional realization opens the story's final movement. Maleficent's love for Aurora becomes the force the old curse could not anticipate, not because it is clean or perfect, but because it is chosen after damage. It is love that grows from responsibility, regret, protection, and the courage to admit that hatred was not enough to live on. Then the final conflict brings Maleficent and Stefan face to face again. Stefan's fear has hardened into violence. Maleficent is captured, surrounded by iron, weakened by the very material the human world uses against her kind. But Aurora finds Maleficent's stolen wings and releases them. The wings return to Maleficent, and this moment is one of the film's strongest visual payoffs because it restores what the betrayal took from her. She does not just regain a weapon, she regains herself. The final clash with Stefan is not only a battle between two characters, it is a battle between what betrayal created and what healing has restored. Stefan cannot let go of fear. Maleficent finally can, and that difference decides the emotional meaning of the ending. Aurora survives, the Moors and the kingdom begin to move toward unity. Maleficent, once feared as a source of darkness, becomes the protector of the very child she once cursed. The fairy tale does not end by destroying the villain. It ends by revealing that the villain was never the whole truth, and that is the story Maleficent wants you to carry. A curse can begin in pain. A heart can close itself for years. A person can become terrifying when the world teaches them that tenderness is unsafe. But love can still arrive in a form no one expected, not as romance, not as destiny, not as a perfect rescue from outside. Sometimes love arrives as responsibility, sometimes it arrives as regret. Sometimes it arrives as the person you thought you hated becoming the one thing you cannot bear to lose. And this is the moment the box opens completely. What Maleficent does brilliantly is that it understands the power of a single performance holding an entire fantasy world together. Because let's be honest, this film rises and falls with Angelina Jolie. The costumes are memorable, the Moors are beautiful, the fairy tale reversal is interesting. But without Jolie at the center, Maleficent could have easily become a visually expensive idea without a soul. She gives the film its danger, its sadness, its elegance, and most importantly, its contradiction. She makes Maleficent feel terrifying and wounded at the same time. That is not easy to do because the character has to exist in two different cinematic languages. On one side, she has to feel like the iconic dark fairy people already recognize. She needs presence. She needs sharpness. She needs the kind of stillness that makes a room feel smaller around her. On the other side, she has to become emotionally readable. You have to believe there is a heart underneath the armor, even when that heart is buried under years of anger. Jolie handles that balance through control. She rarely overplays the pain. She lets it sit under the surface. A small change in the eyes. A pause before a line is delivered. A smile that feels amused and bitter at the same time. When Maleficent is cruel, Jolie makes the cruelty feel theatrical, but not empty. When Maleficent is gentle, she does not suddenly become a different person. The softness arrives carefully, almost reluctantly, like a door opening just enough for light to enter. That is why her scenes with Aurora work so well. Aurora is not written as the most complex character in the film, but Elle Fanning gives her exactly the kind of warmth the story needs. She plays Aurora with innocence, but not lifeless innocence. There is curiosity in her, there is openness. She seems like someone who has grown up outside the full poison of the human kingdom, and that makes her connection to the Moors feel natural. The brilliance of their relationship is that Aurora does not defeat Maleficent through force. She disarms her through trust. Look closer at what that means. Maleficent has built an entire identity around not needing anyone. She has turned power into distance. She has made fear useful. Then Aurora comes along and refuses to treat her like a nightmare. That refusal becomes more powerful than any weapon in the film. It forces Maleficent to face the possibility that she is still capable of being loved, and maybe even more frightening, still capable of loving someone back. That emotional construction is one of the strongest parts of the movie. The story works best when it focuses on reversal. The villain becomes the protector. The curse becomes the thing its creator revets. True love is removed from the shallow romantic shortcut and placed inside a relationship built through care, guilt, patience, and chosen responsibility. That is a smart structural choice because it gives the familiar Sleeping Beauty framework a new emotional engine. Instead of waiting for a prince to complete the fairy tale, the film asks whether Maleficent can undo the emotional damage she created. That is much more interesting. It also gives the film a strong thematic spine. The movie keeps returning to the same idea from different angles. Power without love becomes isolation. Revenge may feel like control, but it does not restore what was lost. A wound can explain darkness, but it cannot heal itself. These are simple ideas, but they are strong fairy tale ideas, and Maleficent communicates them clearly enough for a wide audience while still giving adults something emotional to hold on to. Visually, the film also knows exactly how to frame its title character. Maleficent's silhouette is unforgettable. The horns, the robes, the cheekbones, the staff, the way she stands against mist, flame, stone, or forest. Every image is designed to make her feel mythic. And that matters because this is a film about reputation. Maleficent is not only a person inside the story, she is also a legend being formed in real time. The visuals constantly remind you why people would fear her, misunderstand her, and turn her into a symbol. The direction and production design are especially strong when they connect beauty with danger. The malls are not just pretty, they are strange. They feel alive in a way that can be playful one moment and threatening the next. That gives the fantasy world texture. It is not a clean postcard version of magic. It has teeth, shadows, movement, and personality. The human kingdom, by contrast, feels deliberately rigid. The castle is impressive but emotionally colder. The stone walls, weapons, armor, and ceremonial spaces tell you that this is a world obsessed with control. That visual division makes the conflict easy to understand without needing long explanations. The film shows you two ways of seeing the world, one built around coexistence, the other built around possession. The music and sound also support the emotional fairy tale tone. The score gives the film a sweeping, haunted quality, especially when Maleficent's pain or power rises to the surface. It does not always dominate the scene, but it often helps the emotion feel larger than ordinary life. That is important in a story like this because the feelings are not meant to be small. Betrayal, grief, revenge, regret, and healing are presented as mythic forces, and the sound design around wings, magic, and movement adds weight to the fantasy. When Maleficent flies, there is a sense of force and freedom. When magic appears, it feels tied to intention, not just decoration. When iron is used against her, the film makes that weakness feel painful and invasive without needing graphic detail. But the one scene that stands above everything is the moment Maleficent realizes Aurora has become more than the target of her revenge. That scene is unforgettable because it changes the entire meaning of the film. You can feel Maleficent trying to resist the truth. She does not want to care. Caring would mean admitting that her hatred has failed to protect her. Caring would mean accepting that the child she cursed is innocent. Caring would mean facing the possibility that her worst act did not give her peace, but created a new pain she now has to live with. That is where the film becomes emotionally alive, not in the battles, not in the spectacle, not even in the curse itself. It becomes alive in the quiet horror of regret, because regret is more complicated than villainy. A villain can be defeated. Regret has to be carried. And Maleficent's best moments understand that. They show a character slowly realizing that revenge did not restore her rings, did not undo betrayal, did not make her whole, and did not protect her from love returning in a form she never expected. That is what the film does brilliantly. It takes a fairy tale villain and gives her an emotional wound big enough to reshape the story around her. Where Maleficent falls short is not in its central idea. The central idea is strong. Reframing one of Disney's most famous villains through pain, betrayal, regret, and chosen love is a powerful direction. The problem is that the film sometimes moves too quickly through the emotional territory that deserves more weight. That is the biggest weakness. This story is built on a deep wound. Stefan's betrayal is not just a plot point, it is the event that breaks Maleficent's trust in love, in humans, and in the part of herself that once believed connection was safe. Because of that, the aftermath should feel enormous, and sometimes it does. Angelina Jolie's performance carries the shock, the grief, and the cold transformation beautifully. But the film itself does not always sit with the consequences long enough. It jumps from pain to curse, from curse to observation, from observation to attachment with the speed of a fairy tale. That gives the movie momentum, but it also softens the psychological impact. You understand what Maleficent feels, but you sometimes wish the story would let those feelings breathe more deeply. The second issue is Stefan. On paper, Stefan should be one of the most tragic and disturbing characters in the film. He is not simply a villain from the outside. He is someone who once had Maleficent's trust and then chose ambition over love. That makes him emotionally important. He is the human face of betrayal. He represents what the kingdom does to innocence. He should feel complex, conflicted, and terrifying in a very personal way. But the film pushes him into obsession so quickly that he sometimes becomes more of a symbol than a fully layered person. His descent into paranoia works thematically, but it could have been richer. We needed more of the man inside the monster, more guilt, more denial, more moments where he almost understands what he has done but refuses to face it. Instead, he often feels like the movie's necessary antagonist rather than a character with the same emotional depth Maleficent receives. That matters because the stronger Stefan is, the stronger Maleficent's arc becomes. If his betrayal feels complicated, her pain feels even more tragic. If his downfall feels psychologically detailed, the final conflict becomes more than good versus bad. It becomes two wounded people choosing different paths after the same event. The film only partially gets there. Another weakness is the pixies. They are meant to bring comic energy, and in small doses that make sense. A dark fantasy needs some lightness. The problem is that their comedy often feels too broad compared to the emotional seriousness of Maleficent's story. When the film is exploring betrayal, grief, and moral transformation, the pixies can feel like they belong to a different movie. Their incompetence also creates a strange tension. The story needs Aurora to be raised away from the castle, but the pixies are shown as so careless that it becomes hard to believe they were trusted with such an important task. Maleficent secretly protecting Aurora helps solve that problem emotionally, but it also makes the pixies feel less like characters and more like comic tools. Aurora herself is another place where the film could have gone deeper. Elle Fanning brings warmth and sincerity to the role, and that matters a lot. But Aurora is written more as a symbol of innocence than as a fully textured young woman. She represents goodness, trust, and emotional healing. That works for Maleficent's journey, but it limits Aurora's own journey. We do not always get enough of her inner life. What does she truly want beyond wonder and belonging? How does she process the truth about her past? What does it mean for her to love Maleficent after learning the curse came from her? Those questions are there, but the film does not explore them as deeply as it could. And because of that, the emotional relationship sometimes feels slightly one sided. It is deeply important for Maleficent, but Aurora could have been more active in shaping its meaning. She deserved more agency, especially near the final act. The pacing also weakens the ending in places. The return of the wings is visually powerful and emotionally satisfying, but the final battle arrives with a blockbuster rhythm that does not always match the quieter emotional story that came before it. The spectacle is not bad. It looks dramatic and the imagery is strong. But the heart of the film is regret and healing, not combat. So when the movie leans too hard into action, the emotional focus becomes slightly blurred. The film also simplifies its moral world a little too much at times. The Moors are life, the kingdom is control, Maleficent is wounded, Stefan is corrupted. Aurora is innocence. These fairy tale shapes are effective, but they can also make the story feel less complex than its best idea deserves. Still, these flaws do not destroy the film. They just keep it from becoming the richer, sharper character study it could have been. Maleficent works because its emotional core is strong. It struggles because it sometimes rushes past the darker, messier, more human version of that core. And that is the frustrating thing. The box has something fascinating inside. The film just does not always open it all the way to understand what Maleficent is doing. You have to place it beside other fantasy films that also try to reopen familiar stories from a different emotional angle. The first obvious comparison is Snow White and the Huntsman. That film also takes a classic fairy tale and darkens the world around it. It gives the story more armor, more mud, more battle energy, more political danger. But Snow White and the Huntsman is still mostly built around the conflict between heroine and villain. The queen is fascinating, visually powerful, and tragic in certain ways, but the film does not fully enter the emotional center. Maleficent does. That is the difference. Maleficent is not just a darker fairy tale, it is a villain reversal story. It does not simply redesign the old world, it changes the moral camera. Instead of asking you to watch the innocent princess survive evil, it asks you to understand how the so called evil figure became the person standing at the edge of the cradle. That gives Maleficent a stronger emotional hook. Even if Snow White and the Huntsman sometimes feels bigger, rougher, and more dangerous as a fantasy world. Then there is Wicked, which is probably one of the closest spiritual comparisons. Wicked also takes an iconic wicked woman from a famous story and asks whether history judged her fairly. It questions reputation. It questions propaganda. It questions who gets called good and who gets called evil when power controls the narrative. In that sense, Maleficent and Wicked are almost cousins. Both stories are about misunderstood women whose identities are shaped by fear, betrayal, and public storytelling. But Wicked has more room to develop its world and relationships. Its emotional architecture is broader. It explores friendship, politics, social judgment, and personal identity in a more layered way. Maleficent is more direct. It is simpler, cleaner, and more focused on one wound and one healing bond. That simplicity helps it emotionally, but it also limits it. If you want a richer world of moral ambiguity, Wicked goes deeper. If you want a sharper, more visual, more mythic fairy tale centered around one unforgettable presence, Maleficent gives you that. Another useful comparison is Beauty and the Beast, especially because both stories are about looking past the surface of a feared figure. But Beauty and the Beast is structured around transformation through romance. The beast must learn tenderness, humility, and love. Belle must see the person behind the frightening exterior. Maleficent changes that formula in an important way. Its emotional transformation is not romantic, it is maternal, protective, and rooted in regret. That makes it feel different from so many fantasy redemption stories. Maleficent is not healed because someone falls in love with her in the traditional fairy tale sense. She changes because she unexpectedly comes to love the child connected to her worst mistake. That is one of the film's strongest choices. It gives true love a wider meaning. But Beauty and the Beast has a tighter emotional progression. The relationship at its center gets more time to grow step by step. Maleficent's relationship with Aurora is powerful, but sometimes it develops faster than it should. You feel the emotional direction clearly. But you may wish the film had given their bond more quiet scenes, more conversations, more small moments where trust becomes visible. You can also compare Maleficent to Cruella, another Disney villain-centered origin story. Cruella is more stylish, sharper, and more playful with identity, fashion, performance, and rebellion. It knows how to make its central character feel like she is building herself scene by scene. But Cruella also has a different energy. It is less mythic and more attitude driven. It is about persona, ambition, and self invention. Maleficent is more wounded. Its power comes less from style as rebellion and more from pain becoming armor. Where Cruella says, "Watch how a persona is born," Maleficent says, "Watch how a heart closes and then watch what opens it again." That makes Maleficent more emotionally sincere, even when Cruella may feel more energetic and modern. So, what does Maleficent do that these films do not? It takes the idea of villain redemption and ties it directly to a redefinition of true love. That is the key. It does not just say the villain was misunderstood, it says the villain's healing comes from protecting the person she once harmed. That gives the story a beautiful moral reversal. The curse and the cure come from the same heart, at two different stages of pain. Where does it fall short by comparison? It is not as politically layered as Wicked. It is not as structurally polished as Beauty and the Beast. It is not as gritty or expansive as Snow White and the Huntsman. It is not as bold and fast moving as Cruella. Maleficent has the strongest central image, but not always the strongest supporting world. If you love Maleficent, you should watch Wicked for another story about reputation and misunderstood power. Watch Beauty and the Beast for a cleaner emotional transformation. Watch Cruella if you want another Disney icon rebuilt around style, damage, and identity. But if Maleficent did not work for you and you wanted the character to remain mysterious, colder, and more terrifying, then the original Sleeping Beauty may actually give you what this version intentionally removes, because Maleficent is not trying to preserve the monster. It is trying to find the wounded person underneath the legend. Maleficent arrived in 2014 at a moment when Hollywood was becoming increasingly obsessed with one question: can old stories be made new again? This was the era when studios were looking back at familiar fairy tales, animated classics, comic book icons, fantasy worlds, and childhood memories, then rebuilding them for modern blockbuster audiences. Nostalgia was becoming a powerful engine, but nostalgia alone was not enough. Audiences did not just want the same story with more expensive visuals. They wanted a reason for the story to exist again. That is where Maleficent found its cultural moment. It did not simply say, "Here is Sleeping Beauty in live action." It said, "Here is the character you feared, but now we are going to ask whether fear told the whole truth." That idea fit perfectly into the 2010s because the decade was full of stories trying to complicate villains. Audiences were becoming more interested in backstory, trauma, perspective, and moral gray areas. The old style of pure evil still had power, but there was a growing appetite for characters who could not be explained with one label. People wanted to know why the monster became the monster. They wanted the wound behind the mask. Maleficent gave them exactly that, but inside a Disney fairy tale, and that made the film both timely and controversial. For many viewers, this was the magic of the movie. It took a character they already knew and made her emotionally accessible. It turned a symbol of wickedness into someone wounded, powerful, lonely, and capable of change. It gave true love a broader meaning at a time when many audiences were ready for fairy tales to move beyond the simple romantic rescue. That mattered. Because by 2014, the idea that a princess must be saved only through romantic love was already being questioned inside family fantasy. Stories were beginning to place more value on sisterhood, self knowledge, friendship, chosen family, and emotional healing. Maleficent joins that shift by making the most important act of love come not from a prince, but from the person who once caused the damage. That is a very modern fairy tale move. It does not reject love, it expands it. Critics and audiences reacted to that choice in different ways. Many audiences embraced the emotional reversal in Angelina Jolie's performance. They connected with the idea that Maleficent was not born evil, that she had been hurt, and that her relationship with Aurora gave the story a new heart. The film became a major commercial success because the concept was easy to understand and emotionally attractive. The villain finally gets her side of the story. But critics were more divided. A lot of the criticism came from the same place we have already opened. The film has a strong central idea, but not always the strongest execution around it. Some critics felt the script simplified too much. Some felt the supporting characters were thin. Some felt that by explaining Maleficent, the movie reduced the mystery that once made her terrifying. And that is a fair debate because there is a real cost to turning an icon into a protagonist. You gain emotional depth, but you lose some mythic distance. The original Maleficent worked because she was almost unknowable. She did not need justification. She was elegant menace. She was darkness walking into a celebration and poisoning the room with pure confidence. This version removes that distance and replaces it with pain. Whether that improves the character or weakens her depends on what you wanted from the story in the first place. That is why audience reaction and critical reaction could diverge. Audiences often responded to the feeling. Critics often focused on the structure, and both reactions make sense. As a feeling, Maleficent is strong. As a full screenplay, it is uneven. As a star vehicle, it works beautifully. As a revision of Sleeping Beauty, it is bold. As a deep political fantasy, it is simple. As a family friendly emotional redemption story, it lands. The awards conversation around Maleficent mostly centered on its visual identity, especially the costume design. And that makes sense because the look of the film is one of its strongest cultural contributions. Maleficent's design is instantly recognizable. The horns, the ropes, the silhouette, the civil elegance. That image carried the marketing, the posters, the trailers, and the memory of the film. It deserves attention for how successfully translated an animated icon into live action without losing the character's visual power. What was more overlooked was the emotional intelligence of Jolie's performance. Performances in fantasy blockbusters do not always get treated with the same seriousness as performances in smaller dramas, but Jolie is doing precise work here. She is not just posing as a famous villain. She is building a character who has to move from innocence to devastation, from rage to regret, from isolation to protection. That range is the reason the film holds together. If anything deserved more respect, it was that. Over time, Maleficent has settled into an interesting place. It is not usually discussed as a flawless masterpiece, but it remains one of the more memorable Disney live action reimaginings because it had a clear reason to exist. It was not just visual replication, it had an angle, it had a question, it had a performance people remembered. That gives it a stronger second life than many films built only on nostalgia. Does it feel timeless? Partly. The visual effects and blockbuster structure place it clearly in its era. You can feel the 2010s live action fantasy machine around it. But the emotional idea still works because people are always drawn to stories about misunderstood pain, unfair labels, and the possibility of change after damage. That part does not age quickly because every generation has its own villains that it later decides to reconsider. And Maleficent arrived at the exact moment when audiences were ready to ask whether the woman in the shadows had been telling a story no one wanted to hear. One of the most interesting things about Maleficent is that the fan theories around it usually begin with the same question: how much of the old Sleeping Beauty story still exists inside this version? Because Maleficent is not just a clean replacement, it feels like a story arguing with another story. The film takes familiar events and changes their emotional meaning, which naturally makes people wonder whether we are seeing the truth, a reinterpretation, or a version shaped by memory. The first major theory is that Maleficent is the real version of the fairy tale, while Sleeping Beauty is the simplified version that the human kingdom told afterward. And honestly, that theory fits the movie very well. Think about it. In the world of Maleficent, the human kingdom has every reason to turn her into a monster. She is powerful. She cannot be controlled. She protects a land the kingdom wants. She exposes Stefan's fear and guilt just by existing. So, if his story is written by the kingdom, of course, the story would become simple. The king becomes the protector. The princess becomes the victim. The dark fairy becomes pure evil. The betrayal that created everything disappears from the official version. That theory holds up because the film is deeply interested in narrative control. It asks who gets remembered as good, who gets remembered as wicked, and what details are removed when power wants a cleaner story. Maleficent, in that reading, is not just a revision, it is a correction. But there is another theory that goes even deeper. Some fans read the Moors and the human kingdom as two halves of Maleficent's inner world. The Moors represent freedom, instinct, imagination, and emotional life. The kingdom represents control, ambition, fear, and social order. In that interpretation, the whole film becomes less about geography and more about emotional psychology. Maleficent begins her because she belongs to the Moors. She can fly, she can protect, she can trust. Then Stefan's betrayal cuts her off from that freedom, and the kingdom's values invade her heart: control, suspicion, revenge, dominance. She becomes more like the thing that hurt her, even while fighting against it. This theory works because the film constantly connects environment with emotion. When Maleficent is open, the world feels alive. When she is wounded, the world darkens. When Aurora begins to soften her, the moss feel warmer again. The landscape reflects the heart. Another popular interpretation is that Aurora is not simply a princess in the story, but a symbolic second chance for Maleficent's younger self. That one is powerful. Aurora is innocent, trusting, curious, and drawn to the magical world without fear. In many ways, she resembles what Maleficent used to be before betrayal taught her caution. So when Maleficent protects Aurora, she is not only protecting Stefan's daughter, she is protecting the part of herself that was once open to love. That makes the emotional reversal stronger. Maleficent does not heal because she forgets what happened, she heals because she chooses not to let the same damage consume another innocent life. Aurora becomes the living reminder that the world can still contain softness, even after cruelty has entered it. There is also a theory about the curse itself. Some people read the curse as less of a magical punishment and more of a projection of Maleficent's own belief system at that moment. When she creates a curse that can only be broken by true love, she does it because she no longer believes true love exists. So the curse is almost designed to be permanent, not because magic requires it, but because Maleficent's pain makes her certain that love is a lie. That theory absolutely holds up. The curse is not only revenge against Stefan, it is Maleficent's bitterness turned into law. She writes her heartbreak into someone else's fate. That is what makes her later regret so meaningful. She has to confront the fact that the coeless version of herself created a reality that the healed version cannot easily undo. Then there is the theory that Dyaval represents Maleficent's conscience. This one is simple but useful. Dyaval is not powerful enough to force Maleficent to change, but he often stands near the edge of her decisions, reacting, questioning, observing, and quietly reminding us that she is not as emotionally dead as she pretends to be. He is connected to her, transformed by her, dependent on her, but also honest with her in ways others cannot be. He becomes the small voice of humanity beside a character trying very hard to appear untouchable. The theories that fall apart are usually the ones that try to make every detail literal or secret. Not every creature in the moors needs a hidden identity. Not every visual echo has to mean a direct connection to another Disney universe. The film is strongest when read emotionally, not like a puzzle box full of secret codes. What Maleficent itself seems to support is this: stories are dangerous when they are too simple. A villain may be guilty and wounded. A hero may be innocent and still connected to harm. A curse may be evil and still come from pain. Love may arrive from the place the old story did not expect. That is why the best fan theories around this film are not about hidden twists. They are about hidden perspective. They ask what changes when the person in the shadows finally gets to speak. The deeper layer of Maleficent is not hidden behind complicated symbolism, it is right there in the emotional wound. This film is really about what happens when love becomes associated with pain. That is the key to opening the whole box. Maleficent does not become dangerous because she was born with darkness inside her. She becomes dangerous because the person she trusted most uses that trust against her. And once that happens, love no longer feels safe. It feels like the doorway through which harm entered. So she closes the doorway. That is why her transformation matters. The horns, the robes, the shadow, the cold smile, the distance, all of it becomes emotional armor. She is not simply becoming evil, she is becoming unreachable. She is building a version of herself that cannot be touched the way she was touched before, and that is painfully human. People do this in real life without magic. They get hurt, betrayed, abandoned, humiliated, or used, and then they decide never to be that open again. They become sharper, quieter, harder, more suspicious. They tell themselves they are stronger now, and sometimes they are. But sometimes what they call strength is really fear wearing a better costume. That is Maleficent. Her power grows, but her world gets smaller. She can command magic. She can frighten a kingdom. She can protect the Moors. She can walk into a royal hall and make everyone tremble. But emotionally, she is trapped in the moment Stefan betrayed her. Her curse is not only aimed at Aurora, it is aimed at the idea of love itself. She makes true love the impossible condition because, at that point in her life, she believes impossible is exactly what true love is. That is why the curse is so revealing. The curse tells us what Maleficent believes. She believes innocence will be punished. She believes love will fail. She believes Stefan's future should feel the emptiness he created in her. She believes that if her heart was broken, then the world should stop pretending hearts are safe things. But here is where the film gets more layered. Aurora does not break the curse because she defeats Maleficent. Aurora breaks Maleficent's belief system. She becomes living evidence that not all love is betrayal. Not all trust is foolish. Not all innocence is weakness. Not everyone who comes close is coming to take something. Aurora's existence slowly challenges the story Maleficent has been telling herself for years. That is what healing often looks like. Not one huge miracle, not one perfect speech, not one dramatic apology that fixes everything. Healing is usually slower than that. It arrives through small contradictions. A person expects cruelty and receives kindness. They expect rejection and receive patience. They expect to feel nothing and suddenly feel protective. Little by little, the old story starts to crack. Aurora is that crack. And Maleficent's deepest conflict is not whether she can defeat Stefan, it is whether she can let the crack become an opening. The wings are the film's strongest symbol because they represent more than flight. They represent the self before betrayal. They are freedom, innocence, identity, and trust all at once. When Stefan takes them, he does not only take her ability to fly, he takes the part of her that believed the sky was hers without question. That is why their return matters so much. When Maleficent gets her wings back, the film is not simply giving her a weapon for the final battle. It is restoring the part of herself she thought was gone forever. But the important thing is that the wings return after Aurora has already changed her. That means Maleficent does not become whole again through revenge. She becomes whole again through love, remorse, and protection. The film is saying something very simple but very powerful. You do not heal by becoming the thing that hurt you. You heal by refusing to let the wound decide your entire future. Stefan becomes the opposite example. He is also shaped by fear, ambition, and guilt, but he never opens. He only tightens. He chooses control again and again. He wants the throne, then security, then revenge, then victory. But every step makes him smaller inside. His castle becomes less like a home and more like a prison built around his own paranoia. Maleficent and Stefan are both changed by the same betrayal. The difference is that Maleficent eventually faces what she became. Stefan cannot. That is why Aurora matters to the moral center of the film. She is not just the sleeping princess. She is the person who interrupts the cycle. Stefan wounds Maleficent. Maleficent wounds Aurora. But Aurora does not return that wound as hatred. Her innocence gives Maleficent a chance to stop the pattern before it becomes permanent. That is the real victory, not defeating a king, not breaking a spell, not uniting two lands. The real victory is that pain does not get the final word. And this is where Maleficent becomes more emotionally meaningful than its fairy tale surface suggests. It understands that people can be both guilty and wounded. It understands that regret can be the beginning of change. It understands that love is not always romantic, clean, or easy. Sometimes love is the moment you realize you cannot undo what you did, but you can still choose who you become after realizing it. That is why the ending works emotionally, because the film does not say Maleficent was always innocent. It says she was more than her worst act, and maybe that is the deeper reason the story connects. We all know what it feels like to be misunderstood in smaller ways. We all know what it feels like when one version of us becomes the version people remember. We all know how hard it can be to return to softness after life teaches us to survive through distance. Maleficent turns that feeling into a fairy tale. A woman loses her wings. A child becomes her mirror. A curse becomes a confession. And love returns not as a fantasy rescue, but as the painful, beautiful proves that even a closed heart can open again. The legacy of Maleficent is interesting because the film did not change cinema by inventing something completely new. It changed the conversation by proving that a familiar villain could become the emotional center of a major studio fairy tale. That may sound simple now, but it mattered. Before Maleficent, Disney villains were often treated as iconic because they were larger than life. They were dramatic, stylish, frightening, funny, elegant, or theatrical. Their power came from clarity. You knew exactly what role they played in the story. They entered, disrupted innocence, and gave the hero something to survive. Maleficent challenged that pattern. It asked what would happen if the villain was not the obstacle, but the wound, not the darkness outside the story, but the heart of the story itself. And once the film became successful, it helped open the door for more villain centered reimaginings, more backstory driven retellings, and more stories built around perspective instead of simple moral labels. You can feel its influence in the way later films became more interested in misunderstood antagonists, damaged icons, and characters once framed as purely wicked. It did not create that trend alone, but it absolutely became one of the biggest mainstream examples of it. It showed studios that audiences would show up not just to see a familiar story recreated, but to see it questioned. That is important, because Maleficent is not only a character, she is a brand of fear. The name itself carries meaning. So when the film says, let us tell her side, it participates in a larger cultural shift where audiences became more suspicious of simple villain stories. People wanted context, they wanted motive, they wanted emotional history, they wanted to know what the official version left out. And this film gave that idea a fairy tale face. Its influence is also visible in Disney's own live action strategy. Maleficent proved that a remake did not have to be a scene by scene mirror to become commercially powerful. It could take one element from an animated classic and rebuild the entire story around that element. That approach is risky, but when it works, it gives the remake a reason to exist beyond nostalgia. That is why Maleficent still stands out among many live action reimaginings. It has a thesis. Whether you love or dislike the changes, the film is clearly about something. It is about repetition, betrayal, healing, and the danger of believing the first version of a story. That gives it more identity than a remake that only tries to reproduce familiar images with real actors and digital effects. The film also influenced how people talk about true love in modern fairy tales. By shifting the emotional solution away from romantic love and toward protective, chosen, almost parental love, Maleficent joined a larger movement that expanded what fairy tale love could mean. It did not treat romance as false, but it refused to make romance the only valid form of saving love. That is one of its most lasting emotional contributions. The idea that true love can come from the person who regrets hurting you, from the protector who did not expect to care, from a bond built outside romance. That idea helped make the story feel modern. It gave the ending a different kind of power because it was not about destiny matching two young people together. It was about a damaged adult taking responsibility for the life she once cursed. That is much more complicated. And because of that, Maleficent's reputation has remained fairly strong, even among people who admit the film is uneven. Over time, many viewers remember the feeling more than the flaws. They remember Angelina Jolie's silhouette. They remember the wings. They remember the betrayal. They remember the betrayal of they remember the twist on true love. They remember the idea that the villain was never only a villain. That kind of memory matters in film legacy. A perfect structure is valuable, but an unforgettable image can last even longer. Maleficent gave modern Disney fantasy one of its strongest live action images. Jolie, standing in full costume, elegant and dangerous, wounded and commanding, became instantly recognizable. The film understood that a character this iconic needed to remain visually powerful even while being emotionally softened. That balance is one reason the movie did not disappear after release. Still, its influence comes with a warning. Not every villain needs to be explained. Not every monster becomes more interesting with a tragic origin. Sometimes mystery is the point. Sometimes evil is frightening because it feels unknowable. And Maleficent started a conversation that later films would not always handle carefully. Explaining darkness can create depth, but it can also remove danger if the story becomes too eager to justify everything. Maleficent mostly avoids that by keeping pain and responsibility connected. It does not say her curse was right, it says the curse came from a wounded place, and then it makes her face the cost of that wound. That is why the film's legacy still matters. It proved that a fairy tale could be reopened without fully breaking it. It proved that an old villain could carry a new emotional story. It proved that audiences were ready to look at the woman in the shadows and ask not just what she did, but what happened before she did it. For film history, Maleficent matters because it captured a very specific moment when nostalgia, revision, feminism, fantasy spectacle, and villain empathy all came together inside one blockbuster. It did not perfect the formula, but it made the formula impossible to ignore. And years later, the most lasting thing about it is not the battle, the castle, or even the curse. It is the idea that every legend has a lock side, and sometimes the most interesting story begins when someone finally opens it. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. The biggest twist in Maleficent is not that the villain has a backstory. The biggest twist is that the curse does not define who she really is. It defines who she was at her most broken. Everything begins with the relationship between Maleficent and Stefan because that is the emotional root of the entire film. As children, they seem to represent the possibility of peace between the Moors and the human kingdom. She is magical, free, connected to nature. He is human, bold, ambitious, and fascinated by the world beyond his own. Their connection feels innocent at first, and that innocence is important because the film wants you to understand that Maleficent once believed in trust. That trust is the thing Stefan destroys. When King Henry promises the throne to whoever can defeat Maleficent, Stefan sees his chance. But instead of facing her openly, he uses their old bond to get close. He cannot bring himself to end her life, but what he does is almost more personal. He takes her wings and presents them as proof of victory. This is the first major turning point, and it explains almost every choice Maleficent makes afterward. The wings are not just body parts, they are freedom, identity, innocence. They are the visual symbol of the part of Maleficent that belonged fully to the sky. So when Stefan takes them, he is not only hurting her physically, he is cutting her away from the version of herself that trusted him. That is why her grief turns into something so cold. She does not simply become angry, she becomes sealed. She crowns herself in darkness because darkness is now safer than softness. The moors become protected, but also shadowed by her pain. The land still lives, but it is no longer light in the same way. That is one of the film's hidden details. The world changes because Maleficent's heart changes. Her emotional state becomes part of the landscape. Then comes Aurora's christening, the scene everyone knows from the older fairy tale, but now the meaning is completely different. In the old version, Maleficent arrives like pure evil interrupting joy. In this version, she enters a room built on betrayal. Stefan has the crown because of what he took from her. The celebration is not just a celebration. It is proof that he has gained a kingdom, a family, and a future after destroying hers. So when Maleficent curses Aurora, it is revenge aimed at Stefan's future. But look closer. The curse is also a confession. She creates a fate that can only be broken by true love because she no longer believes true love exists. That condition is not mercy. At that moment, it is cruelty disguised as impossibility. Maleficent is using her own heartbreak as the law of the curse. She is saying in effect that love failed her, so love will fail Stefan too. That is what makes the curse so tragic. It is not just magic, it is bitterness turned into destiny. The next major twist is that Maleficent becomes Aurora's real guardian long before she admits it. Stefan sends the baby away with pixies, thinking distance can protect her, but the pixies are careless, distracted, and unprepared. Maleficent finds Aurora almost immediately, and at first she watches with mockery, almost as if the child is nothing more than a living countdown to revenge. But the film quietly changes that pattern. Whenever Aurora is in danger, Maleficent steps in. She feeds her, she protects her, she makes sure the child survives. And this is where the movie starts planting its deepest foreshadowing. The person who cursed Aurora becomes the reason Aurora reaches the cursed day alive. That reversal is the whole movie in miniature. Aurora grows up surrounded by the hidden presence of the woman who once harmed her. She calls Maleficent her fairy guardian, not because she understands the truth, but because emotionally she senses something real. And that innocence becomes impossible for Maleficent to dismiss. Aurora is not afraid of her. She does not look at her as a monster. She looks at her with trust. That trust becomes the thing Maleficent cannot defeat. The film's most important emotional turn comes when Maleficent tries to remove the curse. She realizes too late that her revenge has become a cage. The younger, wounded version of herself made the curse absolute, and now the changed version cannot simply take it back. That is one of the smartest ideas in the film. Choices made in pain can outlive the pain itself. You can grow, you can regret, you can understand what you did, but the consequences may still arrive. Aurora eventually learns the truth. She discovers she is Stefan's daughter, that she has been hidden away, and that Maleficent is connected to the curse over her life. That revelation hurts because it breaks the beautiful illusion Aurora has been living inside. She thought Maleficent was simply her protector. The truth is more complicated. Maleficent is both the wound and the protector. That is why the film's idea of love is not simple. Love does not erase guilt. Love does not pretend harm never happened. Love becomes meaningful because it grows in the same place where harm once existed. When Aurora is pulled back to the castle, destiny tightens around her. Stefan has burned every spinning wheel in the kingdom, but the curse finds its path anyway. This is another fairy tale idea the film keeps intact. You cannot defeat the truth by hiding its symbols. The spinning wheel returns because the real danger was never the object. The real danger was the curse itself, born from a wound no one healed in time. Aurora touches the spindle and falls into the enchanted sleep. Then the movie sets up the expected solution. Prince Philip is brought to her. In a traditional version, his kiss would be the answer. But this film refuses that shortcut. Philip is kind, but he does not truly know Aurora. The spell does not break because the story is no longer about sudden romance. That is the second major twist. True love is not where the old fairy tale told us to look. The emotional climax happens when Maleficent approaches Aurora with remorse. She finally admits through action and grief that Aurora has become precious to her. This is not victory, it is heartbreak. She cannot undo the curse and she cannot bear what the curse has done. When she kisses Aurora's forehead, it is not romantic, it is protective, it is regretful, it is love shaped by responsibility. And that is what breaks the spell. The curse is defeated by the one form of love Maleficent did not believe in when she created it, her own. That moment changes the meaning of the entire film. Maleficent cursed Aurora because she believed love was false. Aurora wakes because Maleficent has learned love is real again. Then the film moves into the final confrontation with Stefan. By this point, Stefan is not only a king trying to protect his land, he is a man consumed by guilt, fear, and obsession. He has built his life on a betrayal, and everything he does afterward is an attempt to survive the truth of it. But the more he tries to control Maleficent, the smaller he becomes. The iron trap is important because iron represents the human kingdom's way of dealing with magic. Weaken it, cage it, dominate, cage it, dominate it. Stefan does not want understanding. He wants control. And that is exactly why he cannot win emotionally, even before the physical battle ends. Aurora finding the stolen wings is the final hidden key. The wings have been knocked away like a trophy, proof of Stefan's rise and Maleficent's loss. When Aurora releases them, she restores what Stefan stole. The child of the betrayer becomes the one who gives Maleficent back her freedom. That is beautiful storytelling symmetry. Maleficent regains her wings, and with them she regains the part of herself that Stefan tried to erase. The ending matters because Maleficent does not defeat Stefan through the same hatred that once defined her. Stefan falls because he cannot let go. He keeps choosing violence, control, and fear until those choices destroy him. Maleficent survives because she has changed. She has Aurora. She has her wings. She has a future that is no longer trapped inside the moment of betrayal. There is no post-credits scene, and honestly, the film does not need one. Its final image is emotional, not teaser-driven. Aurora becomes a bridge between the Moors and the human kingdom. Maleficent becomes not the villain of the story, but the guardian of a new one. The two lands begin to heal because the person most defined by pain finally refuses to pass that pain forward. My personal reaction to the ending is that it works because it understands redemption as action. Maleficent is not redeemed because the film says she is misunderstood. She is redeemed because she changes what she protects, what she values, and what she chooses when she has every reason to remain bitter. The final meaning is simple. A curse began when love was betrayed. The curse ended when love returned in a form no one expected. And the woman everyone called evil was never just evil. She was wounded, guilty, powerful, regretful, loving, and finally free. So where does Maleficent finally land? For me, Maleficent is a 6.4 out of 10. That might sound lower than the love I have given certain parts of this film, but that rating feels honest. Because Maleficent is a film with a beautiful central idea, a powerful lead performance, unforgettable visual identity, and a genuinely meaningful emotional reversal. But it is also a film that sometimes moves too fast, simplifies too much, and leaves some of its most interesting characters standing at the edge of the story when they should have been pulled closer to the center. The best version of Maleficent is the character study hidden inside the fantasy blockbuster. That version is strong. When the film focuses on Maleficent's wound, her loneliness, her anger, her regret, and her unexpected love for Aurora, he becomes deeply watchable. Angelina Jolie gives the movie its soul. She understands that Maleficent cannot simply be softened. She still has to feel dangerous. She still has to carry the shadow of the original icon. But underneath that shadow, she lets you see the person who was hurt before she became the legend. That is where the film works. It works as a story about pain turning into armor. It works as a story about love returning in a form no one expected. It works as a modern fairy tale that says, true love does not always arrive through romance. Sometimes it arrives through protection, sometimes through regret, sometimes through the person who made the mistake finally choosing to stop the damage from continuing. But the film does not fully reach the greatness of its idea. Stefan needed more depth. Aurora needed more agency. The Pixies needed sharper writing. The emotional aftermath of betrayal needed more space. The world itself, especially the relationship between the Moors and the human kingdom, could have been explored with more richness. At times, the movie feels like it is rushing past the darker, more complicated story it clearly has inside it, and that is why 6.4 feels right. Not because the film is forgettable. It is not. It has images that stay with you. It has a performance that defines the entire experience. It has a twist on true love that still feels emotionally valuable. But it also feels like a film that opens the box, shows you something fascinating inside, and then closes it a little earlier than you wanted. So who should watch Maleficent? You should watch it if you love fairy tales with emotional darkness. You should watch it if you enjoy villain-centered stories that ask whether the first version of a legend was really the whole truth. You should watch it if you want a fantasy film carried by atmosphere, costume, performance, and a strong central metaphor. And you should definitely watch it if you are interested in stories about misunderstood women, stolen power, and the long road from bitterness back to love. But if you want the original Maleficent to remain mysterious, terrifying, and untouched, This version may frustrate you. If you prefer villains who stay purely villainous, the film's emotional explanation might feel like it removes some of her danger. And if you want a complex political fantasy with deeply developed side characters, Maleficent may feel too simple. For me, this is a streaming watch. It is worth seeing, it is worth discussing. It is worth revisiting for Jolie's performance and the emotional idea at its center. But it is not a film I would call flawless, and it is not one I think everyone needs to own unless this version of the character truly connects with you. Still, the final feeling matters. Maleficent takes a character once remembered as pure darkness and asks you to look closer. Not to erase what she did, not to excuse every choice, but to understand that a person can be wounded, guilty, powerful, and still capable of change. And that is the final truth inside this box. Sometimes the villain is not the end of the story. Sometimes the villain is where the real story begins. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. If you stayed with me this far, thank you for opening Maleficent with me. This is one of those films that becomes more interesting when you do not stop at the surface. Because on the surface, it is a dark Disney fantasy with wings, curses, castles, and magic. But underneath, it is a story about trust, betrayal, emotional armor, and the strange way love can return to a heart that thought it had already closed forever. And that is exactly why films like this are worth revisiting. Not because every choice is perfect, not because every scene lands, but because there is something inside the film that keeps asking to be understood. So now I want to hear from you. Did Maleficent make the character more powerful by giving her a wound, or did explaining her take away some of the mystery that made her iconic in the first place? Drop your thoughts in the comments because that debate is the real heart of this film. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, like the video, subscribe to the film box and stay close. Because in the next video, we are opening another film that looks simple from the outside, but has something much deeper hidden inside. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.